My friends, through many centuries of religious history, one simple statement has been repeated so often that it has lost its true meaning. Ask, and you shall receive. These words of the Master have become almost mechanical upon the lips of the world. They have been spoken in desperation, whispered in fear, shouted in hope, and repeated until they seem to promise some heavenly vending of blessings if only we can find the right way to ask. And yet, in all of this, something essential has been overlooked. For if we were truly understanding the Master's words, if we were truly engaging in the kind of asking he spoke of, there would be no such thing as unanswered prayer. There would be no sense of pleading with the infinite, no strain in spiritual work, no belief that God must be persuaded to act on our behalf. And so we begin here, not with the human idea of asking, but with the recognition that the Master was not teaching the world to beg. He was unveiling a principle that operates at the level of consciousness, not belief. He was opening a door into the inner sanctuary where God is not a being to inform or to convince, but a presence to recognize. You see, the moment we believe we must tell God what we need or instruct God on how to bless us, we have already stepped out of spiritual understanding and into the realm of human ignorance. For the Master also said, "Your Father knoweth what things ye have need of before ye ask him." And unless those two statements are understood together, neither one will be understood at all. Let us, then, put aside the old notions of prayer as petition. Let us lay down the weariness of trying to reach a God somewhere beyond the sky. Let us release the idea of a remote deity who must be awakened or informed before good can flow. For the spiritual truth is far simpler and far more profound. God is closer than breathing, nearer than hands and feet, and the activity of God is forever fulfilled. Asking, in the mystical sense, is not an attempt to bring something into our experience. It is the opening of consciousness to that which already is. In these moments we share together, we shall explore the real meaning behind the Master's instruction. We will look into why so much asking produces so little receiving, and why the prayers of millions rise no higher than human words. We will discover what asking truly is, and what receiving truly means. And above all, we will turn inward quietly, gently, so that the inner ear may begin to hear the voice that does not speak in words. For it is in that silence that the true asking happens, and it is in that recognition that receiving takes place. Let us begin, then, not by asking for anything, but by becoming receptive. Let us be still. Let us become aware of that presence which existed before our need, before our thought, before our first breath. For only in that stillness will the promise be fulfilled. Ask, and you shall receive. Now, let us look more closely at this word ask, for here lies the root of most spiritual disappointment. Nearly the entire world has been trained to believe that asking means pleading with God for something, and so the prayers of humanity rise like waves of anxious desire, requests for money, for health, for success, for relationships, for the changing of circumstances, for the correction of outer conditions. But I must tell you, as gently as possible, that this kind of asking is the reason prayer seems to fail. It is not because God withholds, it is because the one who asks does not yet understand the nature of God. When anyone approaches God with a request for things, they are immediately assuming that something is missing. They are assuming that God has what they lack, and that through sufficient pleading, persuading, or persistent repetition, God may eventually release it. But this is not spiritual truth. It is human imagination. It assumes separation. It assumes two powers. It assumes God somewhere and man somewhere else. It assumes a condition that may or may not be corrected depending on how well one prays. And all of that, my friends, is the very illusion Christ came to dissolve If God is infinite, if God is the fullness of being, if God is the very life of your life, then what is there to request? What lack can exist in infinity? What need can arise in wholeness? What deficiency can appear in completeness? The moment you ask for something, you have accepted a belief in separation from that which is already the reality of your being. That single, subtle belief, I do not yet have, is the barrier to receiving. And so long as you approach God as a needy creature seeking favors from a higher power, you are not praying, you are projecting human fear onto the divine. This, you see, is why so many people say, I have prayed, but nothing happened. Of course nothing happened. They prayed from the standpoint of a self apart from God, a self lacking, a self incomplete, a self hoping that an external deity might intervene. But the Master never taught such prayer. He never instructed anyone to cry out in desperation. He never encouraged anyone to direct God or bargain with God. He said simply, Your Father knoweth what things ye have need of. If that is true, then any request that attempts to inform God is unnecessary, and any attempt to persuade God is ignorance. Consider this. If God is spirit, if God is love, if God is the very essence of your being, then when you ask for something, whom are you asking? Are you speaking to a being outside of yourself? Are you asking love to become loving? Are you asking wisdom to become wise? Are you asking infinity to supply what is already infinite? No, my friends. All such asking stems from the false sense of I, the human, limited sense that believes it stands apart from the source of its own being, that I prays for things, that I begs, that I strives, but that I cannot receive because it does not know who it is. The tragedy is that the world has taken the most beautiful, mystical instruction ever given, ask and you shall receive, and turned it into a technique for acquiring things. But Jesus was not speaking to the outer man at all. He was speaking to the inner self, the one who does not lack, the one who does not fear, the one who does not plead. And until this inner self is recognized, all asking becomes a confession of separation, and all receiving becomes impossible. Let us understand this clearly. Every prayer that begins with God, please give me, is built upon a false premise. Every request that tries to change the outer condition while ignoring the inner truth is doomed to frustration. For true prayer never seeks to change the outer. True prayer reveals the inner. And until that distinction is understood, the spiritual life remains a struggle. So I say once more, the false meaning of ask creates spiritual failure, not because God withholds, but because the individual prays from an identity that does not exist in truth. The moment you abandon the belief that God must be told or persuaded, you open yourself to the real meaning of asking, the silent, inner, turning to the presence that already knows, already is, already fulfills. And it is there, in that shift of identity, that receiving begins. Now that we have set aside the old notion of pleading with God, let us come to the heart of this teaching, for unless we understand what the Master meant by ask, we cannot possibly understand what it means to receive. When Jesus used that word, he was not speaking of words, nor of thoughts, nor of the lips that form requests. He was speaking of a shift of consciousness, an inner turning, a movement away from the visible appearance to the invisible presence. And until this movement occurs, no amount of verbal asking will bear fruit. To ask, in the spiritual sense, is to turn within quietly, without effort, without desire, without agenda, and to rest in the awareness that God is already here. Asking is the moment in which your attention withdraws from the outer world, from the problem, from the fear, from the desire, and sinks gently into the stillness of the spirit. This is the real asking, the only asking that has spiritual value. For the moment you turn within, you are acknowledging a truth that most of the world does not recognize, that God is not out there, but here, not future, but present, not conditional, but eternal. You see, the Master's language was always mystical. He spoke not to the outer ears, but to the inner hearing. When he said, ask, he was saying, become receptive. When he said, seek, he was saying, turn inward to the presence. When he said, knock, he was saying, open the door of your own consciousness and enter into the realization of oneness. Everything he taught was spoken from the standpoint of inner awareness, never outer effort. Asking, then, is not informing God of our needs. It is awakening ourselves to the presence that knows our need before we speak. Asking is not trying to bring God into our experience. It is recognizing that God has never been absent. Asking is not attempting to draw good into our lives. It is acknowledging that good is the very nature of our being. And because this is so true, asking is always silent. It has no form. It is an inner posture, an inner attitude, an inner opening. Let us understand this very deeply. The human mind cannot ask. The human mind asks for things, for conditions, for outcomes, for improvements. It cannot ask spiritually, because spiritual asking requires the dissolution of that mind, the quieting of its noise, the surrender of its desires. Only the soul can ask. Only the deeper self can open itself to its own source. Only the heart that has become still can receive the inflow of spiritual realization. When you turn inward, not with words, but with receptivity, you have already asked. The moment you become quiet, you have asked. The moment you release the problem, you have asked. The moment you become aware of that invisible presence, however faintly, however imperfectly, you have asked. And this asking is the only asking that leads to receiving, because it is the only asking that recognizes the true relationship between God and man, oneness, not separation. Do not think, then, that asking is something you do. Think of it as something you allow. You allow the mind to drop its concerns. You allow the heart to soften. You allow the presence to make itself known. You allow awareness to shift from outer appearance to inner reality. This is asking. This is the prayer of turning. This is the movement from the visible to the invisible, from the problem to the presence, from the human to the divine. And once this inner turning has taken place, even for a fraction of a moment, you have fulfilled the spiritual meaning of ask. Nothing more is required. Nothing more need be said. For the moment you have turned, you have already opened the door through which receiving can occur. Now, let us consider this word receive, for it too has been misunderstood by the world. When we hear the Master say, ask and you shall receive, we imagine that receiving means obtaining the very thing we asked for. We imagine that if we ask for health, we shall receive health. If we ask for abundance, we shall receive abundance. If we ask for peace, we shall receive peace. But this is not the nature of spiritual receiving. For spiritual receiving has nothing to do with acquiring and everything to do with awakening. It is not obtaining something we lack. It is becoming aware of what has always been present. To receive is not to get it, is to realize. It is the dawning within consciousness of a truth that has forever existed, but which we had not recognized. It is the lifting of a veil, the illuminating of awareness, the quiet unveiling of the presence that was never absent. The outer world may shift as a result, but the receiving itself is not the shift. The receiving is the inner realization that brings the shift to pass. You see, the entire world seeks to get, it seeks to acquire, to manifest, to draw into experience something that it believes it does not have. This is the human sense of life, always looking outward, always reaching, always striving. But spiritual receiving begins with an entirely different premise, that all of God's grace, all of God's completeness, all of God's supply, harmony, wholeness, and peace are already embodied within your consciousness. Not one good thing can be added to infinity, and your consciousness, being one with God, lacks nothing of the infinite. Therefore, when you receive, you are not receiving something new. You are awakening to what always was. You are recognizing that the very presence of God is the substance of your being, the source of your life, the law of your experience. And when that recognition dawns, even faintly, even silently, the outer conditions begin to rearrange themselves in accordance with that realization. Receiving is always an inner event. It may be followed by outer forms, healing, supply, harmony, opportunity, but these are not the receiving. They are the reflection, the shadow, the evidence of an inner shift. The receiving itself is the moment consciousness touches truth, or truth touches consciousness. And in that moment, you know without argument, without effort, that God is the only reality of your being. Consider how different this is from the human concept of receiving. The human mind expects results. It expects changes in form. It looks for signs. But spiritual receiving requires none of this. It may bring signs. It may bring changes. It may unfold in ways that surprise you. But the receiving is complete. The moment you feel the inner assurance that something has taken place, the moment a quiet peace settles upon you, the moment you sense the presence more real than the problem, sometimes there will be no words, no message, no vision. There will be only a subtle feeling, an inner, yes, a gentle release, a softening, a sense of being carried. And that, too, is receiving. For receiving is not dramatic. It is not emotional. It is not mental activity. It is the soul remembering itself. And so, my friends, understand this. You can receive without seeing any immediate outer change. You can receive while the situation still appears as before. You can receive without knowing how the outer condition will unfold. For receiving is not in the outer at all. It is in the silent realizations of the heart. And when those realizations come, even in the smallest measure, they carry within them the seed of outer harmony. Never look to the outer to determine whether you have received. Look only to the inner sense of peace, to the quietness that settles upon consciousness when the presence has been acknowledged. That peace is the sign. That peace is the receiving. And from that receiving, the entire world of your experience will eventually conform. Thus, we can say with confidence that receiving is not a matter of time. It is a matter of recognition. The moment recognition dawns, receiving is complete. And the outer world, being but effect, must in time reveal the inner truth that has been realized. Now that we have understood what receiving truly is, we must look deeply at what prevents it. Because, my friends, receiving is never withheld by God. Receiving is never delayed by God. Receiving is never earned nor deserved. It is only recognized. Therefore, the only barrier to receiving lies not in God, not in the universe, not in outer circumstance, but in the one who is asking. And until we see this, we will continue to struggle in prayer, wondering why the promise appears unfulfilled. The greatest obstacle to spiritual receiving is the belief that the one who asks is a separate, needy, incomplete self. This is the false identity, the I that lives in fear, the I that seeks improvement, the I that believes itself to be apart from God, the I that tries to earn grace, deserves grace, or persuade grace. But you see that I is a dream image, a mistaken sense of self, and no spiritual realization can enter while we cling to it. The moment you say, I need, I lack, I want, I must have, you are speaking not from your true identity, but from the false self. That self cannot receive because it is built upon the belief in absence. It cannot receive because it believes in separation. It cannot receive because it asks from a standpoint that does not exist in spiritual reality. And as long as that false self remains the one who approaches God, there is no receiving, only desire, only struggle, only the endless cycle of seeking and disappointment. You may ask, why is it that I cannot receive from that place? It is because receiving requires recognition of oneness, recognition of wholeness, recognition of the presence that is your very life. And the false sense of I cannot recognize this because it is the belief in not having it. It is the sense of a self divorced from its own source, hoping somehow to be reunited, but your true self has never been separated. The separation exists only in the mind, not in reality. Imagine a wave upon the ocean, believing itself to be dry, begging the ocean to give it water. Would this not be a tragic comedy? So long as the wave believes in its dryness, it cannot drink of the ocean even while being made of it. And so it is with us. As long as we approach God as if we are outside of God, as long as we ask as if God is elsewhere, as long as we pray as if God is withholding, we cannot receive. Not because the ocean withholds water from the wave, but because the wave believes it must convince the ocean to do what the ocean is already doing by its very nature. You can see, then, that the great obstacle to receiving is not the problem, not the condition, not the lack. It is the false identity that believes the condition has power. It is the false identity that believes something is missing. It is the false identity that believes it must solve or fix or acquire. As long as that false identity remains the asker, receiving cannot occur, because receiving is the recognition of the truth that dissolves that identity. The false self prays for things. The true self rests in truth. The false self begs for change. The true self knows all is already fulfilled in God. The false self fears. The true self is peace itself. Therefore, before receiving can occur, something must happen, not outside, but inside. The false sense of I must become quiet enough for the true self to be heard. The mind that believes I lack must fall silent enough for the deeper realization I am to arise. The personal sense of self must yield not through effort, but through recognition to the presence of the infinite within. This yielding is not destruction. It is unmasking. It is the lifting away of the veil that hides the truth. The false self does not need to be improved. It needs to be seen for what it is, a misconception. And once it is seen, it loses its power. It can no longer be the one who asks. It can no longer block receiving. It dissolves in the light of the true identity. And when it dissolves, even for a moment, even for a breath, receiving is instantaneous, because receiving is nothing more than the revelation of what you have always been. The presence you have sought is the presence that has been seeking you. Thus I say to you, do not attempt to receive from the false self. Do not try to bring light into a darkness that exists only as a belief. Instead, turn within and let that false identity gently fall away. Become aware of the quiet self, the eternal self, the self that needs nothing from God because it is one with God. That self asks without asking, receives without waiting, and lives in the grace that has no opposite. Up to this point, we have spoken of principles, eternal truths that govern the relationship between God and man, between consciousness and experience. But principles, unless they become lived and embodied, remain only ideas. And so the question naturally arises, how do we practice this? How does one ask in the spiritual sense? How does one turn inward in such a way that receiving becomes possible? Let us enter now into a simple, gentle, yet profoundly transformative practice, not as a technique, but as an attitude of soul. The first step, my friends, is stillness. Not the forced stillness of concentration, not the strained effort to quiet the mind, but the simple willingness to sit for a moment without reaching outward. You need not make the mind quiet. You need only refrain from feeding it. Sit and let the mind chatter if it must. You remain the observer, not the participant. The very act of sitting in that willingness begins the inner turning. Something in you softens. Something quiet within begins to open. The second step is releasing all desire. Lay down, for this moment, every human wish, every fear, every request, every imagined need. Not because these things are unimportant, but because they belong to the realm of the outer self, and the outer self cannot receive. For a few minutes, surrender the problem. Let the mind say, "But what about?" And let it say so without response. The more gently you release these concerns, the more deeply you turn toward the realm of spirit. The third step is the inward turning itself. This is not an action of the mind, but of awareness. You turn not outward to the world, not backward to memory, not forward to desire, but inward to the presence that is always here. How do you turn inward? By becoming aware that something within you is present before thought, beyond feeling, and beneath every appearance. If you simply rest your attention upon that inner sense of aliveness, that subtle awareness that I am, you have already begun the true asking. The fourth step is the real asking. At this point, no words are needed. Words belong to the human mind, and the human mind cannot approach God. The soul approaches God in silence. Yet if a word or phrase arises naturally from the depths of your being, let it be a receptivity rather than a request. Speak, Lord, thy servant heareth. Here I am. Father, I am listening. These are not petitions, they are openings. They are the soul leaning into the infinite, not to get something, but to receive the awareness of what already is. Now comes the fifth step, resting in the invisible. This is the heart of the practice. You rest not in expectation, not in anticipation, not in hope, but in simple being. Let thoughts pass as clouds. Let sensations come and go. Let the body be at ease. You do nothing. You wait for nothing. You merely abide in that quiet awareness which is your true self. In that abiding, a subtle shift begins. Sometimes it is a warmth, sometimes a presence, sometimes a gentle peace, sometimes nothing at all but a sense of spaciousness. This, my friends, is the inner sanctuary. The sixth step is receiving, though no outward sign may indicate it. Receiving is the moment when you feel the slightest touch of peace, the faintest sense of assurance, or simply a deep quietness that was not there before. It may come as a whisper of knowing, all is well. It may come as a lifting of concern, it is done. Or it may come as no message, no words, but a simple release, a sense that something has shifted within, even if you cannot name it. This is receiving. It is the soul recognizing its own completeness. And finally, the seventh step, allowing the outer world to adjust itself. Do not rush from your meditation seeking results. Do not examine your condition to see whether something has changed. Do not ask whether God has acted. God acted long before your asking. All that happens now is that your outer experience begins to reflect the inner realization. The world will rearrange itself in due course, not because you prayed for change, but because you became receptive to truth. Your very consciousness has been touched, and the outer world must eventually conform to the new vibration. Understand that this practice is not a ritual. It is not something you must perfect. It is an attitude, a posture of soul. You may sit for 5 minutes or for 50. You may experience profound peace or only a momentary quietness. None of this matters. What matters is that you turn, however briefly, toward the invisible. That turning is the asking. The peace that follows is the receiving. The outer harmony that unfolds is the demonstration. Practice this gently, my friends, not as a way to get, but as a way to know. And you will discover that every time you turn inward, the infinite meets you there, not because you have called it, but because it has always been there, waiting for recognition. It may be helpful now to illustrate how this inner practice works in actual life, for principles become clearer when we witness their demonstration. I wish to share with you, not as a miracle story, nor as something to be admired, but as a simple example of spiritual law in operation, a moment in which asking and receiving occurred in their purest form. Some years ago, a woman came to me, not for healing, not for supply, not for guidance, but because she believed she had reached the end of every resource available to her. The world had closed in around her. Her business was failing, her health was deteriorating, and the weight of anxiety seemed to crush her very breath. She told me, "Joel, I have prayed every prayer I know. I have repeated every affirmation. I have visualized, begged, pleaded, and still nothing changes." What could I say to her? That she must pray harder? That she must declare truth more forcefully? That she must hold firmer to her affirmations? No. All I said was this: "My dear, you have asked outwardly, but you have not yet asked inwardly." She did not understand, so I said, "You have asked as a human seeking help. You have not yet turned as the soul seeking recognition." She looked at me helplessly and said, "I don't know how to do that." And so I told her, "You do not need to know how. Come, sit with me for a moment and let us be still together." We sat in silence. I said no words. I gave no treatment. I offered no affirmation. I did not reach outward for God, nor did I attempt to bring God into the situation. I simply became still, so still that the mind had nothing to grasp. And as I sat in that stillness, I felt the presence. Not dramatically, not forcefully, but gently, like a soft breath that fills the room without disturbing a single thing. After a few minutes, something in her shifted. Her shoulders relaxed. Her breath softened. Her eyes, once filled with strain, grew quiet. She whispered, "What is this?" And I answered, "This is receiving." She said, "But nothing has happened." And I said, "Everything has happened." For in that moment, She was no longer asking from the false self. She was no longer trying to fix her life. She was not reaching for supply or healing or peace. She was resting in the presence itself, and in that rest, the soul received what the mind could never obtain. She left quietly, and for several days, nothing in her outer life changed. But within, something had been touched, something that could not be undone. Then, little by little, the outer world began to reshape itself. A business opportunity arose from a direction she could never have anticipated. A long-standing conflict resolved effortlessly. Her health began to show subtle signs of improvement. The heaviness that once clouded her mind lifted, and a new confidence took its place. When she returned to me weeks later, she said, "I didn't do anything, Joel. I didn't try. I didn't ask. I didn't beg. I only remembered that feeling of stillness." And I said, that feeling is the receiving. When you touched the presence, the outer world had no choice but to respond. And so you see, my friends, the demonstration did not occur because her problem was solved. It occurred because she was solved. The real healing was not the improvement of outer conditions, but the disappearance of the false self that believed it must manage, control, or supply life. When that self became quiet, the true self emerged, and the true self lacks nothing. The outer world simply conformed to the new awareness. Understand this well. The demonstration did not begin with action. The demonstration did not begin with prayer. The demonstration did not begin with thought. The demonstration began the moment she turned inward, truly inward, and received the peace that was already hers. Every demonstration in your life will follow this same pattern, not because it must happen a certain way, but because consciousness is always the cause, and form is always the effect. Do not look to the form. Do not look to the result. Do not look to the world to confirm God. Confirm God within, and the world will align in its own manner and in its own time. This, then, is the way of true asking and true receiving. It begins in silence, unfolds in peace, and expresses itself in harmony, not through the efforts of man, but through the natural operation of divine law. Up to this point, we have spoken of asking and receiving as moments, moments of stillness, moments of realization, moments in which the veil is lifted and the presence becomes tangible. But the spiritual life is not built upon isolated moments. It is built upon a state of consciousness. And so the question arises, what happens after receiving? How does life unfold when one begins to live from the inner awareness rather than the outer appearance? The first and most profound change is this. You no longer approach life with fear. Not because the world has suddenly become gentler, not because circumstances always appear favorable, but because you have discovered that the real source of your being is not in the world at all. When you have received even once, even faintly, the assurance of the presence, fear loses its authority. It may knock upon the door of thought, but it finds no dwelling place within you. You have touched something deeper, something eternal, something that cannot be shaken by events. This does not mean problems disappear. It means they no longer define you. It does not mean circumstances cease to challenge you. It means they no longer control you. You meet life not with panic or reaction, but with a quiet turning inward, again and again, knowing that every appearance is but that an appearance, and that the truth of your being remains untouched. The second change is that you stop living by effort and begin living by grace. Human life is filled with striving, planning, controlling, manipulating, attempting to force outcomes through personal will. But once you have tasted receiving, you begin to realize that the personal will has never been the source of harmony. You begin to see that your greatest breakthroughs came not when you struggled, but when you surrendered, not when you commanded, but when you allowed. And so a new way of living emerges, more peaceful, more spacious, more aligned. You take the actions that are needed, but you take them without strain. You make decisions, but you make them without fear. You move through your day with an inner poise, because you know that you are not the actor, you are the instrument through which the infinite performs its own work. The third change is this: you stop seeking. You stop seeking spiritual experiences, stop seeking spiritual demonstrations, stop seeking signs or proofs or assurances. For once you have turned within and received the faintest whisper of the presence, the search is over. You may continue to deepen in realization, but you no longer search for God as if God were missing. You no longer look outward for fulfillment, for now you know that fulfillment is the nature of your own being. I do not say that you will no longer have desires or aspirations, but those desires will no longer arise from emptiness. They will arise from the fullness of being, which means they will unfold naturally, without the strain of personal will. You will find that much of what you once pursued now comes to you effortlessly, not because you seek it, but because your consciousness has become a welcoming place for harmony to express itself. The fourth change is perhaps the most beautiful. Your relationships transform. When you live as one who receives, you no longer look to another person to complete you, to reassure you, to validate you, or to supply what you believe you lack. You meet others not from need, but from fullness. You see them not as separate minds and personalities, but as expressions of the same presence that animates you. And in that seeing, judgment dissolves, fear dissolves, expectation dissolves. What remains is love, not emotional dependency, not attachment, but the quiet recognition of the one appearing as the many. Finally, you discover something rare in this world, a continuity of inner peace. Not the peace that comes when everything is going well, not the peace that depends upon the absence of conflict, but the peace that remains even when the waves of life rise. This peace is not produced by thought. It is not the result of affirmations or mental control. It is the natural fragrance of a consciousness that has turned inward and received the presence. It is the peace that Christ spoke of when he said, "My peace I give unto you," a peace that the world cannot give and the world cannot take away. This, then, is the life of one who receives, a life rooted in the invisible, guided by inner knowing, sustained by grace, undisturbed by appearances, and illumined by the awareness of oneness. Not a life free from challenges, but a life in which challenges become opportunities for deeper realization. Not a life without action, but a life in which action flows from the quiet center of being. When you begin to live this way, the promise of "ask and you shall receive" ceases to be a command or an instruction. It becomes a description of how the universe operates. It becomes a law written upon the heart. It becomes the rhythm of your daily life, a rhythm of turning inward and receiving, turning inward and receiving, turning inward and receiving, until the line between asking and receiving disappears, and all that remains is the steady awareness of the presence that has always been. And now, my friends, we come to the close of this teaching, not the end of the journey. For the journey of spirit has neither beginning nor end, but the close of our shared contemplation in this moment of time. What remains is a simple invitation, a call that has echoed throughout the centuries, a call that every mystic has heard, and every seeker must eventually answer. Turn within, listen, be still. You may forget every word I have spoken, you may forget every principle, every explanation, every story, but if you remember this one thing, you will remember the essence of the infinite way. God speaks in silence, and only in silence can you hear. No book, no teacher, no outer method can replace this inner listening. Everything else is preparation for it. Everything else is a pathway leading you to the door, but only inner listening opens the door itself. You have learned what it means to ask, not to beg, not to plead, not to attempt to move an external God, but to turn inward in receptivity. You have learned what it means to receive, not to acquire, not to manifest, not to change the outer world by force, but to awaken to what already is. You have learned that the greatest barrier to receiving is the false sense of self, and that when that self becomes quiet, the true self stands revealed. You have learned how to practice, gently, naturally, without strain, without ritual, without effort. You have learned what it looks like when spirit demonstrates itself in your life, not through magic, not through miracles, but through the natural unfolding of divine order. But now, I say to you, do not stop here. Do not let this teaching remain as mere inspiration or pleasant thought. Take it into your daily life, not as a task, not as a burden, not as a discipline, but as a remembering. Let the inner turning become your first response to life. Let the silence become your refuge. Let the presence become your constant companion. There will be days when the mind is noisy and the world presses heavily upon you. There will be moments when fear arises, when doubt whispers, when the old habit of seeking outward attempts to take hold once more. When that happens, do not struggle. Do not condemn yourself. Simply turn again, however briefly, toward that quiet center within. Even a moment's remembrance is enough. Even the faintest whisper of the presence is enough. Grace does not measure your worthiness. Grace flows simply because you are. The call to inner listening is not a demand. It is an invitation. It is not an obligation. It is a return to your true home. It is the soul's natural movement toward its source, although the source has never left you. Every time you turn inward, you are not approaching God from a distance. You are awakening to God at the very place where you already are. And so, as we conclude, I say to you, not go and seek God, but go and recognize God. Go and recognize that the presence you have sought is the presence that has been seeking you. Go and recognize that every breath carries the whisper of the infinite. Go and recognize that the kingdom is not something you enter, it is something you allow to be revealed. Let these words rest gently upon your heart. Ask not with words, but with stillness. Receive not with expectation, but with awareness. Live not as a seeker, but as one who has found. And as you move through the days to come, remember this truth. The presence goes before you. The presence walks with you. The presence lives as you. You need only be still and listen. This is the call. This is the way. And this, my friends, is the eternal promise fulfilled within you.